One dimension to consider when evaluating a source, a hub, a community, is the quality of the people and the skill and quantity of the people. And one way of looking at all of this is the network effect. LinkedIn is one of the more valuable companies on earth because it has one of the more valuable networks for communication between professionals. If you want to write to Bill Gates or talk with any number of people, LinkedIn is one of the better ways to go about that. And so what's the Lazaris network? Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand Lazaris's network is very small. So we're talking about, less than 1% of the global population, for sure, and maybe less than 1% of 1% of the US population. It's a small network. And the operating system of working within the Lazaris paradigm is also consequently a small network. Now, the more computers run Windows, for example, the more a new Windows program is useful. Meaning if you write a new piece of software for Windows and less than 1% of 1% of people are running Windows, it's not as useful as if 2/3 of the world's population is running Windows. So there's value in the network. Facebook may be a crappy company, but the fact that its network is so big of people makes it useful, more useful than an excellent company that only has, 5 users. You get the idea. So Lazaris has a small network of, people that have come across and have some warm reaction towards Lazaris. There's also people that are anti-channeled entity, et cetera, and all of that. So it's a small network. And the operating system is not necessarily advantageous, meaning I don't think I've ever had doors open for me because of an association with Lazaris. There might have been an instance, but I can't think of that. Now, in terms of the types of people and quality, of people drawn to Lazaris, Lazaris says in one of their presentations that there's only about 2% of the global population that are really, actively growing and learning, that are kind of at the cutting edge of reality. And he says, at a global level, people can accept that, but then he brings the attention to the room. He says, what about only 2% of people in this room kind of meeting this quality of excellence, et cetera? 2% of people at Concept Synergy, 2% of people in this room. He said, then it gets a little bit more uncomfortable. And I've done some business within the Lazaris community and lots of business outside of it. All things being equal, I would rather do business with a non-Lazaris friend than with a Lazaris friend based on my experience. So for doing business, I would say there's a net negative statistically, just in my statistics. And if I look at, for example, relationship quality and skill, I think is another good, metric to consider. Relationships are some of the most important elements in a rich life. I formed a men's group with a couple of Lazaris friends. Both of them were, just incensed with, with their romantic partners who are also Lazaris friends, and just endlessly fuming about how unfair and this and that the relationship was. I don't know if that's more or less than average. It seemed more than average, of kind of complaining and dissatisfaction without the skill to do anything about it. And I think that's, pretty common. My worst therapist of hiring 40 different healers and therapists over time was a very long-term Lazaris friend who basically hated men and charged me, for a long rant of, how much he disliked men and all of this type of thing. And I unfortunately hadn't had experience of good therapists at the time, so, I paid for a 4-hour rant of, masculinity attack. And that's so, professionally, that kind of ties in with that awareness. I wouldn't say that Lazaris friends know how to run a business more than average, and in many cases less, than average. And that would extend to concept synergy. I think they would do dismally if they actually had to compete in a competitive marketplace. In terms of, as I say, marriages, that type of thing, less than 20% of the Lazaris friends that I've met and got to know have relationships that I would admire. I've had some relationships, about 20% of my relationships I really thought were terrific relationships. Everything that I applied and learned in that relationship, to do that was outside of the Lazaris framework. And then I would also point out that if one is very deeply involved with Lazaris, one of the things in a romantic context, in a family context, in a deep friendship, you want to share that with the person you care about. And in my experience, in the time that I was primarily focused on Lazaris, it was an alienating experience because no one had ever heard of Lazaris, and it's not the kind of thing you can bring up at dinner parties and have be, I didn't find that I was respected for bringing up the topic. So, that's, my experience on that kind of network dimension. Now, another, I think, important dimension or band to explore and evaluate the relationship with Lazaris is to kind of step back and look at channeling as a whole, and possibly even metaphysics as a whole. Metaphysics is kind of an operating system, channeling being a source. Now, I was, as I was beginning to get disenchanted with Lazaris and the Lazaris community, I was talking with a friend about what I was wrestling with, etc. And she just said, well, of course, that's a channeled being. That's looking at things from a very different perspective. You're getting better results from human beings because they're looking at it from your perspective as a human being. And that hadn't really occurred to me, but I think that's worth considering. I would say that almost everything that I've learned that has been terribly useful, practical, successful, etc., and often the most fun is from a human being in a dynamic, interactive setting, as peers, as equals, as lovers, etc., and not in a hierarchical setting of the channel and the client and things of that nature. So the therapy that has been the most healing, etc., has been with human beings, not channels and psychics and all of that. So, that's on one level. The other thing that I would, just kind of highlight is that the metaphysical operating system is in many ways far more cumbersome and less effective than what I would call a probability system. And I had a close male friend within the Lazaris community for some time who was losing money trading commodities year after year, year after year, and beating himself up for not being a good metaphysician and being able to program and change his beliefs and make money trading commodities. Now, I, at that point, was not as into Lazaris, etc., and so I just did a little bit of digging and took a few minutes, and it turned out that 80% of all people trading commodities lose money. Now, this is very similar to a gambling type, situation. More than 80% of people who go to Vegas and place 100 bets leave Vegas with little or no money that they were betting. So, if you've got a 98% probability that if you place 100 bets that you'll have little or none of the money that you were betting after 100 bets, and you look at another probability field and say that, okay, there's a 90% chance that if you buy a home, maintain and improve it and sell it 30 years later, that you will make a lot of money and save money on owning a home. Then all you have to decide is which probability field do you want to be a part of? Do you want to do something in which 98% of the people are going to lose money? Or do you want to do something in which 98% of people are going to make a lot of money and save money? And so if you understand the statistics, the probability field, then you can make an informed decision about which game do you want to be playing. And that works really, really well. You don't have to bust your negative ego. You don't have to process and program. You don't have to do 33-second techniques. So this was this was something that just drove me crazy, watching my friend bet in an arena in which 80% of people lost money, in which he lost money every single year, and in which he was applying a metaphysical rather than a statistical paradigm, and shaming himself continually for not being a good metaphysician. Why? Because Lazaris said that you not only create your reality, you create the result of your reality. That if you didn't create it, you didn't want it, that all this stuff. So he was like, why don't I want to make money, this and that, the other? So he was distracted with all of these things. Whereas I just looked at it and said, I'm not going to trade commodities. I'm going to do this where most people win. Similarly, when I got into the self-publishing business, I looked and read a statistic, and 99% of all self-published authors lose money on their self-publishing project. 99%. So if I'm going to self-publish, do I want to count on beating those odds? Or do I want to say, okay, this is an arena in which I'm not going to make money. I'm not going to do it to make money. So if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it to have fun. I'm going to do it to enjoy my creativity. And given that I already know that 99% of people lose money, my main kind of focus should be to kind of not spend money. in self-publishing that I don't want to lose, that I want to get back. And so I just developed a very basic strategy where I would create my own book covers, and then later when Fiverr came along, I would hire 4 people for $5 to create 4 different book covers, and then there was always things I liked about different ones, and then I'd have one person, combine the things I liked out of, and then there's a book cover for $50, which I expect to lose, right? But that's okay. I'm not spending $3,000 on a book cover. I'm not hiring a $10,000 editor and then losing that. So I'm playing with it, right? And I'm working with that statistic. Now, that is so effective. It is so successful. And yet, one of the things that's somewhat interesting is Lazaris never gathers statistical data within the room. Now, if Lazaris did a workshop gathering statistical data at some point and published it, you might learn that, for example, I don't think I've ever had one 33-second technique work once in 300 times, right? Maybe it's 400 times, but I've never saw it up. There it is. I visualized it, and it came in just like in the 33-second technique. I don't even do the 33-second technique, with a purpose of visualizing. If it's in a meditation, it's more just to enjoy, Lazaris's tone of voice, which I find, uplifting and, adding a richness to my life. But, statistical data, if Lazaris would say, hey, how many people have more than a 50% success rate with the 33-second technique? How many people have used it 50 times or more? And how many people, get what they're visualizing within, Lazaris says you should see really strong signs within 3 days. How many people are getting that? And if you just look around the room and you see that less than 1% of people are getting good results on that. And how many people are getting good results on this technique? And how many people have ended fear or healed their guilt and whatever? And how did they do it? And how many people has it lasted more than a month or whatever? And then you can see the room, and you can play the games that are winning, and just give up on the ones that are statistical losers. That most of the time for most people, they're losers. Those are not good games to play if you want to win and if you want to have fun. And I don't know of that many better techniques than, one, knowing what's important, what matters, personal relationships, for example, health, certain foods and diets and things that really bring out, well-being. So knowing what matters. And then 2, and for me, location was a huge one. Like, I traveled the globe, and I found that I'm 300% happier in Thailand. As soon as I land and start engaging, I'm 300% happier. So there's a very low headwind to graceful happiness in Thailand for me. So one of my single most intelligent steps is to spend more time in Thailand. Not to bust my negative ego or something like that, which I don't think I've ever seen an outcome, come out of that, other than to be anxious, is this ego, is that ego, is this ego? There's a lot of that, but that's not increased well-being, that's increased paranoia. And so, not a very good, technique. And just bringing data into well-being. Every human being in the history of humanity has wanted to feel sustainably better and avoid feeling chronically worse. And the question in the scope of channeling and in the Lazaris technology is do channels do that better than people? And if so, when and where and for whom? And then which technologies within the body of work do that more effectively than any other technique available. In other words, if you can spend 3 months and have a 10% boost in sustainable well-being doing 10 Lazaris tapes or whatever, or you can get in a plane and fly to Thailand and have a 300% sustainable boost to well-being. And I actually did a survey of the people living there. The average was a 300% increase in well-being. If you can just do that by being there, that's a better technique, statistically speaking. So listening to the data, which means you have to gather the data, and unfortunately, Concept Synergy has never sent out a survey. I've never received a survey ever in any workshop, and that puts Concept Synergy kind of in the bottom 10% that don't gather any statistical data about their clientele. And that may be willful ignorance in terms of if they've heard enough and seen enough to know that Lazaris does not attract a better than average crowd, a more happy than average crowd, a more successful than average crowd, a crowd that has more fun than average. Just that's not the result. And so gathering data about that isn't going to help promote, and sell the Lazaris material. All I can say is I've gotten surveys from AT&T, Whole Foods, Amazon, just about every place I do business, there's some kind of a dialogue about how are we doing and how can we do better. But Lazaris, despite producing the tape on excellence, does not seem to inspire anyone at Concept Synergy to want to lead the field, to be excellent, or to gather the data that would allow them to do so. And if proximity to resonance in Lazaris has that effect, and the law of resonance is a reliable law, one might be fair to question, is Lazaris a lower resonance than average businesses, et cetera, in their pursuits of excellence and feedback, et cetera? Because in many areas, Concept Synergy is lagging behind other excellent information companies. If we examine Lazaris's strengths, I think there are a number of them. One of the strongest points in my observation of Lazaris is the integrity and coherence of the message. So Lazaris has been talking for almost as long as I've been alive. I think Lazaris may have started channeling a year before me or a year after I was born. And there's a large body of work, and I've listened to over 1,000 hours of it. And, there is a tonal variation. Lazaris has a range from being very mechanical, sounding almost robotic, to being incredibly warm. And that does seem to trend a little bit, meaning some of the earlier tapes seem more robotic. Also, when Lazaris is talking simply to a recorder rather than to a group, the voice sounds a bit more robotic. And then during the height of Lazaris's popularity, I would say, was when Lazaris was most warm. And then some of the more recent recordings sound, I wouldn't say robotic, but perhaps with Jach's age, much thinner in tonal variation and in energy that's present. But that being said, if one looks at the ease and accuracy with which Lazaris will quote, for example, underlying truths stated 5 or 10 years ago, or will reference recordings, a decade earlier. And just being able to narrate without using notes and present a composition, 3 hours long, 4 days long, etc. There's quite a lot of, I guess you could call it field or presence, to be able to get that amount of order in a fair amount of complexity over so many hours, so many days, so many years, so many decades. And that's, I think, puts Lazaris in the top 1% of speakers, be they channeled or non-channeled. Less than 1%, and perhaps considerably less than 1% of the population is capable. It may be 1 in 10,000 human beings is capable of delivering a narrative of that complexity and coherence without following slideshows or reading from a book. And so that's a definite strength. I would say that the consistency of the message is also relatively, a big strength. The lack of hooks in a fear-based thing, I don't recall Lazaris ever trying to say that we're the only people you can work with. Now, that kind of conflicts slightly with saying, reality is ultimately resonant causation, and we're the highest resonance that will ever be and has ever been. You're free to work with anyone, but we're the best, basically. There's some hook there. But Lazaris has also said that, that they're not a good fit for everyone, and encouraged people to think and read and explore, etc. And so that's, I'd say there's a balance there. But certainly Lazaris is not doing the kind of power grabs that, the Catholics or, any major religion is doing in many workshops. If you go to something like a landmark forum, there's a lot more brainwashing and hooks built into that. Another strength, I think, is the vulnerability and the tenderness, which I think is highly medicinal in a chauvinistic culture, to emphasize tenderness and empathy. So I think, these are Lazaris's strengths. And I guess if you look at all of the different tapes and workshops as different shades of a color wheel, it makes Lazaris relatively comprehensive in covering much of the color wheel, to basically be able to speak about reality through this paradigm and through this paradigm and through this paradigm. And while admittedly many, if not all, of Lazaris's topics and paradigms have already been talked about by human beings, Lazaris is not introducing, so far as I can tell, new paradigms that no human has talked about. Lazaris seems to compile and do a better job of articulating, in many cases, paradigms, research, ideas that human beings have talked about. The breadth. If the culture seems to be interested in codependency, Lazaris can do a codependency workshop that's, has nuance and depth that you might not find in many other codependency workshops. If people are focusing on shame, Lazaris can do workshops on shame that, that provide enormous depth and comprehension you may or may not find in, a book you pick up on shame. And so I think that's a real strength. I think it's also, when you concentrate power or, the ideal in any person, there's a tremendous vulnerability to, towards abuses of power. Those are often financial and sexual and, social climbing, etc. There can be a range of abuse. And like, for example, I have yet to hear of a single situation of, Jach sexually abusing a Lazaris friend. That may be there, but I haven't heard of it in the way that you hear that at John of God or, any number of other, Rajneesh or any number of other, teachers, healers, gurus, anything of that nature. So, I think that's a strength. Given that I don't think it's a very good fit to sell spirituality and sell friendship to the highest bidder, I consider it a strength that Lazaris and Jach did not ever raise the personal conversation rates to the highest bidder, but rather they allowed the waiting list to be long. And I think that's a strength. The thoughtfulness of the material, I think, is a strength. The nuance and the complexity of the material are definite strengths. And then for me personally, out of all of the different work that Lazaris has done, healing the inner child and healing the inner adolescent is the one area where I've noticed a substantial shift in well-being and quality of life, and shifting what might have been into what is and what has been for the better. So for me personally, that, out of every tape and workshop, etc., those, I think they were connecting with Lazaris series, where there was a month-long process of healing the inner child within and healing the adolescent, that I noticed a shift inside and out around those two tapes that I have not noticed around any of the other tapes and material. So those, for me, are a summary of Lazaris' strengths. Now, if we turn to examine the weak points in the Lazaris analysis, I would say that there's a couple of kind of weak points to look at and explore. Now, one of the biggest is the resonance equation. So Lazaris is saying that they are the highest resonance that ever has, is, or will ever touch the planet or humanity. So that's one statement. Then secondly, Lazaris is saying that all reality creation is ultimately resonant causation. That's the second piece. And the third piece is that the law of resonance suggests that whenever two resonances are present, that the higher resonance will come down, or the lower resonance will come up, or they will both meet somewhere in between. And Lazaris, the fourth piece of this, Lazaris then says that we're not moving. In other words, we're the highest resonance that has ever been or will ever be, and we're not going to come down, which means that if you spend time with us, if you connect those pieces, if you spend time with us, your resonance is going to go up. And since resonance is the ultimate reality creation, as your resonance goes up, your reality will go up as well. So that's, a subtext, I would say, to the desire and interest to spend more time with Lazaris. Now, that being a hypothesis, or if one wanted to create a hypothesis from that, one would suggest that Lazaris friends will have a higher resonance than the average person, and that who aren't connected to the highest resonance, and that their lives will be working better than the average person. At least average, that's, just, it's not a very high standard. And so then the question becomes, is that the case? And how does one measure it? And this is, quite a shaky area, because one would also hypothesize or, project based on that the people who spent the most time with Lazaris for the longest amount of time would have the highest resonance and the best realities. And if we look at reality, we look at, how do we measure success? We have physical health and vitality. We have financial health. We have emotional health and vitality. We have the quality and, vitality of personal relationships. And then we have how well the outer reality is going. And if one wants to take that to the extreme, where Lazaris is saying you create it all, then you could say, well, how good is the world? How good is the world in terms of its success for, the people closest to Lazaris? And is that a different world, than the world for everyone else? Well, this projection that this would be the case, in some way, seems to be inverted, meaning if you look at Lazaris's closest friend, Penny, lots of failures within the concept synergy paradigm, and lots of dreams collapsing and not working out, and books not selling of Lazaris and stuff. All kinds of things not working, very well for concept synergy and, Penny's business. The death certificate, containing a chronic state of morbid obesity, being chronically morbidly obese is not the peak of physical vitality and health. And so, I would say perhaps lower than average. Certainly business, above average, in the sense that most small businesses fail within 10 years. A majority of small businesses fail. So the fact that concept synergy is still alive, 40 years later is above average. But it's also in a monopoly framework, meaning that, by Lazaris choosing to only channel through concept synergy or through Jach, and to only publish through concept synergy, I mean, if one is selling information, which is pretty much, it's never been cheaper to sell information with the internet. if one is selling information that works by the highest resonance to ever touch the planet in a monopoly framework, it's very, very hard to fail. And so by that, in terms of what you would expect around that, knowing that Jach and Penny use the Lazaris techniques, et cetera, to create their business, I would say that concept synergy does much worse than one might expect, given that, just exceptional benefit of such a monopoly in this industry, meaning selling information and selling digital reprints. It's the easiest business if you've got something that people want. And if you believe in human nature, and what is human nature? To seek to feel sustainably better and to try and avoid feeling chronically worse. That's human nature. Now, if you have something that elevates well-being, that works, human nature is going to make it more popular. If you do not, then, people don't want to think more. They don't want to work harder. They want the easiest path to success as a general rule. Now, if Lazaris with perspective, et cetera, offers that, then there's going to be an exponential explosion of demand. And that isn't the case. Meaning Lazaris has not continued an exponential period of growth. Lazaris actually peaked and has been in a steady decline for over 10 years. And what that means is that people are choosing other paths of well-being other than Lazaris, that for them are more fun and more successful. Now, I remember my own point of just puzzlement, having worked with Lazaris for more than 10 years. I think I'd worked with Lazaris, about 15 years at that point. And I had a relationship with another Lazaris friend. And there were all kinds of dysfunctional areas that weren't working. And the Lazaris tapes on relationship were not helping at all. I would say they were making things worse. It's always irritating when your relationship partner says, well, why did you create that? And what's your payoffs and stuff? And you could criticize the Lazaris friends for doing that. But they're actually emulating Lazaris. And here's what I mean. Lazaris doesn't say, we're creating our reality and we take responsibility for all of our interactions and their impact on you. And that if you're having a miserable time in your relationship with us, we own that and we work on our beliefs to create something different and all of that. Lazaris doesn't take responsibility for the reality that he's engaging with in terms of human beings. He doesn't say, why do I have, when a Lazaris friend goes into self-pity, Lazaris doesn't say, what's my payoff for creating a relationship with someone in self-pity? How's that mirroring my shadow? Where am I suppressing? Lazaris says, you have payoffs. You are creating your own reality. And so when a Lazaris friend says, what's your payoff for that? Why did you create that? They're actually copying Lazaris's emphasis on the other rather than on themselves. And, this is common. Whenever you have a teacher, a parent, any kind of, idealized person or role, people will copy not what the person does, but what they say. They'll copy what they do, not what they say to do. They'll copy what they do. And Lazaris talks a tremendous amount about how you create your reality. And so a Lazaris friend talks a tremendous amount about how you create your reality. It's a copying protocol. So the question is, if Lazaris is creating universes, why isn't Lazaris creating great, transformative, high-energy, successful relationships with all of his friends and taking responsibility for that? And instead lecturing them on how they can take responsibility for their relationship with Lazaris and with other people. So that protocol seems to be somewhat infectious within the community, and it doesn't work very well. And when I went to workshops and read books about relationships that worked, and I saw just massive improvements in my relationship with a Lazaris friend after trying the Lazaris techniques that didn't work, this was a real mind twister. How is it that Lazaris's techniques as the highest resonance, are working less than some random human being who's just paid attention to what's going on and shared it in a book or sharing it in a workshop? And this led to a whole series of awarenesses for me. One is that interactive, kinetic practice type relationships in group settings are a far better way to teach something than lectures. Now, that being the case, meaning watching the majority of people learn more from interactive practice in group setting than by listening to a monologue. The question is, why is Lazaris creating a reality where he's doing the inferior technique, the monologue, rather than the group interaction? If the goal of life is to create conscious success and conscious fun, and listening to a monologue is less successful and less fun than good group design and interaction, why is Lazaris choosing a suboptimal technique that produces suboptimal results? What are suboptimal results? People who come to every Lazaris event, who fall asleep. I would say that probably about 20% of the Lazaris room is on the edge of sleep at various points in a workshop, based on my observation, including myself, because it's not engaging enough kinetically. Secondly, other than repeating verbatim in the best case scenario what Lazaris said, there's not a lot of engagement and interaction. 90% of all of Lazaris's interaction in a group setting are monologue. At most, there's 10% chance for very controlled feedback. Anyone want to sit up in the front of the room and then just you have 3 to 5 minutes maybe to talk? And then Lazaris may talk for 20 minutes in response to what you said, but maybe 5% of the room has 5 minutes in an entire workshop to actually speak. And for those like myself who learn more by talking than by listening, one of the reasons I write books is I finish a chapter and I think, that's a good idea. And then I try and take my own advice. And so my books are for me at least as much as they're for anyone else. And in many ways, they're more for me because I cannot depend on, an audience. But I can depend that I'm going to read it. And when I take action in response to my own advice, my reality goes up. When I take action in response to Lazaris's advice, I would say, it's more of I wouldn't say reality goes up. I would say that there's, it's more flat. And sometimes it goes down because it takes time to listen to a 3-hour tape, just as it takes time to take a number of actions. And so, there have been a number of times where I listen to a Lazaris tape for 3 hours and find that my business has fallen apart somewhat in that 3 hours because I wasn't answering the phone and wasn't doing this and wasn't doing that. And so the reality is actually down. And there's no up other than the enjoyment of thinking about what Lazaris has to say. So I would say that, if we continue and we look at, if we look at Penny, and we look at shame, abuse, obesity, regular failure, humiliation, loneliness, frustration, all kinds of things not going very well, ending up with an early death in a combination of codeine and vodka. That's not a great reflection of the highest resonance that could be, despite proximity. Moving out to Jach, highest resonance, highest development, not particularly. As is often the case with a monopoly, that's coming in from the outside. And, it's, for example, Saudi Arabia and oil-producing countries often do very poorly because they're given this natural resource so their people don't have to develop real talent. And then when their resource dries up eventually, they have nothing, and they're less skilled than an average person. And so unfortunately, when you take, someone like Jach and, provide all this attention around channeling, Jach isn't challenged by enough people to keep his integrity or to grow as a friend, to become a competent human being and compete for worthiness in, a culture where the standards are quite high in order to elicit some interest and enthusiasm. But being the sole channel of Lazaris, Jach gets a lot of that attention through Lazaris, which then doesn't require personal development. And so is that really good for Jach? You can see the same for the business. Relative to something like Amazon, concept synergy is subpar. If you look at, what Amazon did and is doing in terms of, for example, the whole Audible revolution with more than 1 million unabridged Audible books at some of the best prices and some of the best varieties and the best Audible players and just terrific user interface. Audible has to compete for that. Concept synergy doesn't, meaning anyone who's bought into the idea of Lazaris being amazing because he said so, that's the only place to get it. And so, the business is subpar. The training is subpar of staff and employees. The payment of employees is subpar. It's average, right? We're not talking about an excellently run company, excellent training, excellent customer experience, excellent website, excellent media interface. We're not talking about any revolution and pioneering around anything. we could easily sum it up with, we've got Lazaris, people have to come to us and put up with whatever we deliver. And we don't have to be the best, and we're not, and take it or leave it, right? And that's normal with monopolies. Governments are like that all the time. And so is that a really high resonance? You know, it sounds like Penny was very creative, and in times, you know, around changes and ideas and things like that. But if you talk with the employees or the people who worked with or for Jach and Penny and Concept Synergy, many of them have suboptimal experiences, sub-average experiences. You know, one real estate agent saying that, you know, they like Lazaris, but Jach and Penny, the worst clients in a career, right? Picky, demanding, difficult, you know, et cetera, all this. So that's a high resonance, you know. So it doesn't seem to work. It seems as if Jach, Penny, and then of course Michael committed suicide. Jach, Penny, Michael, and the staff at Concept Synergy, if anything, my impression is it's less healthy than average, because there's more potential for spiritual abuse, and there isn't more abundance or competency. You will find many, many better run companies that have nothing to do with, you know, Lazaris or channeled entities, that treat their employees better, that treat their customers better, that are truly evolving the technology. And that's not happening to the people closest to Lazaris. And then you look at, okay, what about the people who work with Lazaris exclusively? They go to every workshop, they buy hundreds of thousands of crystals or hundreds of thousands of dollars of, you know, very high-priced crystals. They read and do everything they could do on the forum. Are they healthier, happier, more successful on average than the people who, you know, work 5%, who, you know, buy crystals at 5 to 10 times cheaper places other than Concept Synergy, who, you know, go to a variety of different events, whose dose of Lazaris is maybe at 5 or 10 or 15% dose in their growth, etc. Are those people happier, having more fun, being more successful than the people spending the most time with Lazaris? And my impression is yes, and that's my personal experience, that when I just decided, okay, let's just let go of my attachment to Lazaris and focus on what works based on feedback in my reality, what works and what's the most fun. That took me completely outside of, you know, the Lazaris terrain for, you know, a good decade, and all kinds of things we're learning and growing, et cetera, that worked in that time. And so, you know, that's not what one would predict. So I think that's a real weak point. And I think the fact that Lazaris was bigger in the 80s than he is today, 30 years later, is a reflection of the fact that a majority of people are not having, you know, such hits with things like the 33-second technique or this or that, the other, that they're rushing out and telling their friends, you've got to listen to this tape, my whole life changed. Or you can see my life just gets better and better and better. And people ask, why is your life so great? And I say, well, it's Lazaris. And then just spreads word of mouth, and, you know, there's more and more people. That's not happening. And I think it would be happening if the vast majority of people who discover Lazaris experience much better lives and are much nicer people to deal with than non-Lazaris friends, and are willing to share, and that ripples out. So I think that's a really big weakness. And it also kind of ties into the question. Lazaris says that we have to deal with a reality in which we have impact. To the extent that that's not happening is, I think, to the extent that Lazaris, and by extension of their choice to be in a monopoly framework with concept synergy, Lazaris and concept synergy are not having that impact in the way that other movements have had in the same period. And so I would highly recommend Lazaris in about 5% of areas. But I would recommend many, many other things that Lazaris covers outside of that 5%. Like if someone wants to understand trauma, PTSD, complex PTSD, I wouldn't send them to Lazaris. I would send them to Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. If someone wants to understand childhood abuse, I would send them to Alice Miller more than Lazaris. If someone wants to do men's work, I would send them to Robert Bly before I would send them to Lazaris. Someone wants to do women's work. I'm sure there are good, better resources than Lazaris. If someone wants to grow their business, I would send them to a variety of places rather than Lazaris. But that is not popular to talk about within the little cocoon of information control that, would be the online forum or concept synergy. And so the diehard fans within that bubble are not actually asking Lazaris to compete for impact with all of those other resources. Now, admittedly, Lazaris does not say only work with us, but Lazaris says they're the best and their techniques work, which implies that. But Lazaris also says to think, but if you think and you observe that you get better results outside of the circle of Lazaris, then you have to consider that Lazaris may be wrong in how well his techniques work or their techniques work. So I think that these are kind of legitimate things for Lazaris, Jach, and concept synergy to evaluate, to consider. And I think that to the extent that Lazaris wants to model, the idea that everyone creates their own reality, it would probably be more useful to hear Lazaris talking about their payoffs for creating martyred friendships. Friendships where, I'm complaining about Lazaris, for example, right now. If Lazaris talks about why they're creating that and this and that and how their beliefs tie in, and then if why they want that or changes that dynamic, that's probably a much more useful example than telling other people who aren't creating universes in their spare time to do something Lazaris themselves doesn't seem to be able or willing to do or talk about, right? And so, I think that that's some of the biggest questions and criticisms or weak points that I observe in the relationship with Lazaris.